I believe in the case of British arms supplies to Israel, the use of the Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri, the flights that have gone on there, the surveillance flights over Gaza, it does require an inquiry. I want to know what advice was given to the Defence Secretary, the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister, what legal advice was given to them, and what those surveillance flights were actually doing. Because if they were doing their job properly, they would have known that schools were being bombed, hospitals were being bombed, that children were being killed. Where did that information go?
We're here today at the Palestine Deep Dive studio with Jeremy Corbyn, former Labour leader, now independent MP for Islington North, who is today putting a bill into Parliament, proposing a bill for an inquiry into the British role in the Gaza genocide. Thanks for joining us, Jeremy.
It's a pleasure.
Firstly, can you just describe what this bill is? What is the mechanism that you're using to try and get this inquiry started?
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here, and well done, Palestine Deep Dive, for all that you do. Could I just read out the long title?
Please do.
Because that'll put it into the context you need then. And it is a bill to make provision to require the inquiry to consider any UK military, economic or political cooperation with Israel since October 2023, including the sale, supply or use of weapons, surveillance aircraft and Royal Air Force bases, to provide the inquiry with the power to question ministers and officials about decisions taken in relation to UK involvement and for connected purposes. I'm putting the bill up in Parliament under the 10-minute rule procedure, which means I get 10 minutes to speak on it. If somebody, an MP, opposes it, then there will be a vote on it. And if the House agrees that the bill can go forward, then I get the authority to get the bill printed by parliamentary sources, and then we try and get to debate for a second reading of the bill later on. It's very unlikely, quite honestly, it's going to become law. I know that. But the demand for a public inquiry in exactly the same way that those of us that opposed the Iraq War in 2003 onwards managed to eventually get the Chilcot inquiry, which whilst maybe it should have had greater teeth, did bring out an awful lot of truths about ignoring legal advice, about the illegality and about the veracity of the information on which the Cabinet made its crucial decisions. I believe in the case of British arms supplies to Israel, the use of the Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri, the flights that have gone on there, the surveillance flights over Gaza, it does require an inquiry. I want to know what advice was given to the Defence Secretary, the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister, what legal advice was given to them, and what those surveillance flights were actually doing. Because if they were doing their job properly, they would have known that schools were being bombed, hospitals were being bombed, that children were being killed. Where did that information go? I have asked in Parliament on other occasions that all of the information collected by RAF surveillance flights should be made available to both the ICJ, International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court.
And even before we have an inquiry, well, if there is an inquiry, but surely, for me, what I don't quite understand is, isn't it already obvious that the British are not only complicit but participants? If you've been sending daily spy flights from RAF Akrotiri over Gaza for 5 hours a day, sometimes 2 flights, so 10 hours a day, and explicitly they've said we're giving that intelligence to Israel while it is carrying out a genocide and committing hourly war crimes, you're a participant. If you're supplying intelligence to a belligerent in a conflict which is committing war crimes, isn't that evidence enough?
Well, that is very important evidence, and you're quite correct in what you say, that it is complicity in it. What I want is an independent inquiry to get ministers and former ministers in the previous Conservative governments, both parties involved in this, to be forced to answer questions on it, and senior officials as well. This is done in our name as a country, as the UK. And so I am utterly determined that we'll get there, one way or the other. And it took years after Iraq, and it was finally in 2016 that the Chilcot report was published. And indeed, I have a printed version of all the volumes of the Chilcot report in my office, and it makes horrific reading, but it was incredibly detailed. And you'd have thought that report would be a lesson to any future government. You know, one day you're going to be found out. And so, yes, there's the complicity in the surveillance flights and the information, which they claimed was collecting information about the hostages. Well, it's a bit hard to know what information they were collecting about the hostages that wasn't already known.
Oh.
The bigger issue to me is obviously that, but the question of the bombardment of civilian targets. The other point that you make about complicity is an important one. I went to the ICJ for the hearing when South Africa made the original application under the Genocide Convention. And they've given their opinion. The ICC has given its verdict on it in that it's issued arrest warrants. And if a country is arraigned before the court on a charge of genocide, and that is well known to those that supply the weapons, principally the US and Britain, but there are other places as well, then they are complicit in acts of genocide. And so ministers can't wash their hands of this and say, we knew nothing about it. They knew everything about it. Absolutely everything about it, because they had the surveillance information anyway. They probably had more information than anybody anywhere in the world. I'm not sure if the US were flying surveillance flights or not. I suspect not. I think it was only Britain.
Yeah, exactly. Britain's the only one that's been doing a daily spy flights. But another interesting part of this is, for me as a journalist covering this topic, it's clear that the government, not just the Labour administration, but the previous Conservative one, has enacted a cover-up. Because Kenny McCaskill, who was one of the leaders of in Parliament for trying to get transparency around this, around the use of RAF Akrotiri, around the spy flights and arms as well, he asked a question about RAF Akrotiri in November 2023, and the question was rejected, the parliamentary question, which he said was unheard of. So that, you know, usually when you put down questions they don't want to answer, they say, well, we can't for national security reasons. Yeah. Talk about this, but they actually said you cannot ask any questions about RAF Akrotiri, you can't even put them down. So I wanted to, do you think there's a cover-up going on within the British government about this participation, complicity in the genocide?
There is absolutely a cover-up going on, and at various times ministers give different answers. David Lammy sometimes gives different answers to Hamish Falconer on this. I have made it my business to raise the issue of the components of the F-35 jets, that 15% of which, the total volume of which, are made in the UK. I've asked this persistently now for, well, ever since the whole conflict began. And eventually, Lammy and Falconer both conceded that they started off by saying they couldn't stop the supply of components because it would upset the global production of the F-35 jet. They then went on to say eventually that they wouldn't supply parts directly to Israel. And so under pressure, they eventually agreed with me that by putting components into the global supply chain, Israel could buy them from the global supply chain just like anybody else. They also rather bizarrely claimed that it was impossible to prevent a particular component made in this country, say the ones made in Sheffield or elsewhere, impossible to prevent them going to Israel because they could no longer be identified. This is utter nonsense of the first order. These arms supply companies are very efficient and also very well aware of all of their components, and so everything is traceable. And under the arms trade conventions that Britain applies to itself, there is supposed to be an end-user certificate on every component or arm that is sold to anybody. They have to sign an end-user certificate to say it will not be used to commit crimes against humanity or war crimes, genocide. I rest my case.
Yeah.
We are supplying parts for F-35 jets that are committing acts of genocide in Gaza.
And I wanted to ask about another element of the UK role in Gaza. Again, we're scratching the surface on all this stuff because so few journalists, or none really in the mainstream, have investigated this. But this is an issue you've worked on in Parliament, which is the special forces as well. Because I know that previously you tried to get a War Powers Act where you bring the SAS and SBS within.
Yes,
but can I just finish that? So in October 27th, it was leaked to The Sun that the SAS had deployed to RAF Akrotiri for quote-unquote Gaza operations. The following day, a D notice was sent out by the Ministry of Defence to stop all any more information coming out about the role of the SAS. We have zero information from that day about what the SAS have been doing in Gaza potentially or in Israel. So would you want this inquiry to look into the role of the special forces and also obviously equally secretive intelligence institutions like MI6 and GCHQ, which might have been part of a spy team which was also sent to Israel early in the genocide?
The D notice is the glass ceiling of British journalism, and it's been in operation for a very long time, where the newspapers, now all media, agree with the government they will not report a particular issue because it is national security. Governments hide behind this and have hidden lots of terrible things. Think of the colonial massacres of the 1940s in Malaysia, 1950s in Kenya, for example. And we now have a D notice in relation to this, which means that we haven't had the reporting that you quite rightly put forward, which is the use of special forces. I don't know the answer to your question, whether the special forces are in Gaza or not. I suspect they could be, because it was not that difficult to fly a military helicopter from Cyprus over to Israel, and clearly that would be in cooperation with the IDF, so it wouldn't be shot down on the way there. Now, the question of war powers is a very important one. I pledged as leader of the opposition that I would introduce a War Powers Act so that British forces could not be committed without specific reference to Parliament. Now, take the history of this. In the run-up to the Iraq War, many of us demanded that Parliament have control over the situation. To begin with, Tony Blair didn't want that. He said, no, it'll be done as it's always been done, where the Prime Minister uses their powers, the executive powers under the, uses their executive powers under the royal prerogative to commit British troops to war. Blair then spotted a political opportunity here. Clever. He said, okay, you can have a vote in Parliament. And there was one. That meant every MP that voted for the Iraq War is complicit in the Iraq War. They knew exactly what they were voting on. There was no dubiety about it. It was very clear what they were voting on. And so my view was that there should be a proper War Powers Act, which Shami Chakrabarti, who was then our Shadow Attorney General, and myself drafted. We put the whole thing together as a comprehensive war powers legislation and included it in the manifesto for the 2019 election. And so it's there. The proposal there. Indeed, the bill was drafted as a bill. It's absolutely there. And quite specifically, it included special forces, because that has always been the Achilles heel of the whole operation. Even during the debate and the vote on Iraq in 2003, the government of the day, that government, the Blair-led Labour government, refused to answer questions about the use of special forces. And the special forces are very well funded, very well financed, very hard to find out exactly how much is spent on them, because it's quite opaque, the way the Ministry of Defence report things. But if we are to have democratic control of our foreign policy and what we're doing, then we've got to know. We've got to know what they're up to and why they're there. Now, what possible reason could there be for British Special Forces to be taking part in the illegal occupation of Gaza and the West Bank by Israel? If Russia's occupation of Ukraine is illegal, then surely Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank is equally illegal.
And do you think that ministers like Keir Starmer, David Lammy, obviously the previous administration, Rishi Sunak, Grant Shapps, James Cleverly, do you think they should be, well, obviously this is the first stage with a potential inquiry, but do you think they should be investigated by the ICC, knowing what you know already without, and as I say, we're still scratching the surface? I
do, but I think that's a matter for the ICC to decide whether to do it and whether another country will refer them there and refer to the ICJ. My purpose of this bill is to make sure there is a UK-based inquiry system, because this would be, to me, a move to improve democracy and accountability of public administration in this country, because we have an inadequate system of parliamentary accountability of what government does. Parliament's powers might sound great, but they're actually quite limited. The government decides when Parliament meets. The government decides what legislation goes before Parliament, apart from some small opportunities, which is one I'm trying to exploit, to introduce a private member's bill. And so Parliament is very much almost an appendage of government rather than holding government to account. It does have the ultimate power of a motion of no confidence in a government or an individual minister, but that is very unusual and quite extreme. And with the party whipping system, almost impossible to conceive of a situation where that would happen.
And just you mentioned at the start that you're not hopeful that it will go through, become law. So obviously this issue isn't going to go away in that context. We do need to move it to a next stage. And if, as you say, Parliament is not working to hold the government to account, then the people will have to do it, journalists and activists. And obviously during the Vietnam War, there was famously a Russell Tribunal on Vietnam where it was a parallel inquiry to any kind of formal institutions. But would you be in favour of putting in train something like that if it doesn't go through?
The reason I said it's unlikely to go through is for a 10-minute rule bill to go through, it needs government support for them to give parliamentary time for it, which I'd be very surprised if they gave time for it. So I want to be realistic about it. The purpose of this bill is to raise an enormous banner and flag as to why we need public accountability. You're quite right. During the Vietnam War, again, it was very hard to find out what was going on. And indeed, if there were British Special Forces in Vietnam, there are reports there were, considerably well-sourced reports that there were. And the Russell Tribunal performed a very, very important function. And it's been used as a kind of template many times since then. I'll give you two examples. One was when General Pinochet was eventually arrested in this country under an international arrest warrant emanating from Spain. I was very much part of the campaign to get Pinochet before the courts. We then organised an independent examination of Pinochet's record, of the torture and the culpability of him, and indeed governments that had supplied arms, including Britain, to Chile. We organised it in Parliament. A lot of people came, and it got quite a lot of publicity.
Yeah.
That was an important step forward. We did very similar on the Julian Assange case. We did two Russell equivalents, well, two that I was involved in. There may have been others. One we did at Church House, Westminster, where a group of MPs, a large group of MPs, listened to the evidence about Julian Assange and how wrong it was that he was in a maximum security prison in Britain, why he was in any prison at all for that matter. Yeah. And I also went to a very powerful one at the National Press Club in Washington, where the same place where he'd made a speech there. So we had a Russell-style tribunal at the National Press Club. And it's actually to the credit of the National Press Club in Washington that they were prepared to allow the venue to be used for it. And so it helped build the campaign of consciousness about the plight of Julian Assange.
And just on, you mentioned when you talked through the bill at the start about RAF Akrotiri, which is the huge airbase that...
It's a sovereign airbase. That's the important thing to remember. When Cyprus achieved its independence in 1960, the independence was supposed to be guaranteed by Britain, and in return Britain got two bases that are indeed sovereign bases, so they are British territory. That's Akrotiri and Tegea.
But again, the governmental system there it's run as a military dictatorship. Even though it's 3% of Ireland, all power, legislative and executive power, resides in one man, usually a man called an administrator, who's appointed by the MOD in London. You can't, as a journalist, send Freedom of Information Act requests about them. Very hard to get any information. But it has become the central international site for supplying and supporting the genocide in Gaza. So the inquiry will cover it. Do you think it should be shut down? Do you think it has any place somewhere like RAF Akrotiri in the modern world?
It's a colonial hangover.
Yeah.
Britain had a colonial policy for 300 years of obsessing with maintaining the occupation of India, from ever since the British East India Company started occupying on behalf of Britain and then administering. And so they were determined to have supply points all the way to India. So those supply points were particularly Aden, Cyprus, and the Indian Ocean. So it is, I think, essential that we sort of get rid of these colonial hangovers. What's the point, and why does Britain need a base there? Now, I was in Parliament this week listening to the Secretary of State for Defence telling us about the global role of British forces and how they can now hit anywhere in the world, and we are a global power. Well, hang on a minute. We're an island of 65 million people on the northwest coast of Europe. That's not a very big proportion of the world's population, and it's quite a small island that we all occupy. Why do we need a global reach? Why do we have to have forces that can go all over the world? And then MPs get very excited by all this. And in Parliament on Monday, they were asking questions of the Defence Secretary and saying we've got to get ready for a war with Russia and with China, apparently. So we're apparently being prepared for a war against a combined population of, 1.5, nearly 2 billion people.
Yeah.
This is madness.
It is.
This is utter madness. So I asked a question. In this defence review, the word peace barely appears. The idea of strengthening the world's institutions, ICJ, ICC, United Nations, UNESCO, etc., etc., etc. Why aren't we strengthening those institutions as being an opportunity to bring about some kind of peace process? And instead, all we're doing is pouring more and more money into military expenditure, at the same time cutting local government, cutting education, and cutting $5 billion from welfare benefits for people in receipt of personal independence payments so that they can at least live a respectful and respectable life. It's disgraceful.
It is disgraceful. Did you see Keir Starmer at RAF Akrotiri last year, where he said, thank you so much for all you're doing here. We can't necessarily tell the world what that is. What did you think when you saw that?
Well, I was shocked, quite honestly, that he was there saying, well, there's lots of stuff going on here that I can't talk to you about. Well, why did he say that? And why did he go there? And whilst it is pretty obvious, because many people who've tracked planes like your good self, shown that the planes are flying to Gaza, and I would imagine they're flying over the West Bank as well. Are they also going to Ukraine? I don't know.
And this is something that shocked me. I mean, within Parliament, you're probably being shocked by the lack of willingness of MPs to actually take this on as an issue, to get transparency. There is a handful of others, but it's a small amount. But there's even fewer mainstream journalists who have done any work on this, literally. So I looked recently about the spy flights. Now, we're talking about daily spy flights for 18 months that's handing intelligence to a genocidal foreign power. Not one mainstream journalist has ever asked a British minister about those flights, which to me is insane.
An effective media is part of a democratic process of accountability. Parliament has a job to hold governments to account. The media has a job to hold all public institutions to account. Where have they been over this period? Where were they, for the most part, over Julian Assange? Eventually, one or two came half on side to help him out of prison when he was being released. But he did that on his own, and those small number of us around the world who supported him. Now, on media and Parliament, well, media, we need to make more demands on them, and more demands for citizen journalists as well to be heard. In Parliament, what we have is a group of us led by particularly Richard Bergen and Imran Hussain, who have a weekly meeting on legal processes and so on, which is actually quite important. So we then talk to Campaign Against the Arms Trade, talk to your good self and people like yourselves on legal processes. And we have a group of us, which are the 5 independents, which I'm part of, a number of Labour MPs, some implied SNP and so on. But it's not very many. But we do try and coordinate before each statement is made in Parliament, so we all agree on which area of question we're going to put, because there's no point in 10 MPs asking the same question. It's much better we spread it out. So I've basically concentrated on the F-35 issue.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. So this is the part of the participation or complicity in the genocide which has got most media, basically. The media has covered the arms side, not sufficiently, but quite well. But recently a report came out that showed that even after these 39 arms license suspensions, which were announced by the Labour government in September 2024, even after that, they sent over 8,000 munitions to Israel, munitions of war. So it's clear, not only is there a cover-up going on, they're even lying, potentially to Parliament, about the policy that they've enacted.
Yeah, Progressive International, which I'm part of, put together with other organisations a report on arms supplies and showed that far from a decrease in them, they went up. And the Labour government gave far more arms, or supplied far more arms to Israel than the previous Conservative government did. David Lammy claimed there is no longer any supply of arms to Israel. I remain to be convinced that they haven't continued, may even be continuing now. He suspended 30 licences without ever telling us what those licences were. And even very diligent, brilliant journalists like yourself, I don't think you were able to identify what those 30 licences actually were. For all I know, there might have been high-vis vests. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so we do need an awful lot more transparency, which is why I am pushing for an open, demanding, robust, tough public inquiry, because the bombing of hospitals, schools, homes is done in our name by planes partly made in Britain.
And I'm going to ask a controversial question now. Well, it's not a controversial question, but the answer could be controversial. But what's a question I have is, why is Labour so keen to participate in what everyone in the world can see is one of the most horrific crimes of our lifetimes? What is the reason the Labour Party is so willing to provide arms to it, to supply intelligence, to all the other elements of participation? Is it what does Israel serve for the Labour Party for Britain, or is it because their lobbying institutions within the UK have captured the Labour Party to a degree? What's your take on that?
The defence establishment, going back to the 1940s, have always viewed Israel as being the reliable ally in the region. So they've seen it as a security partner in the region. That's always been the basis of it. There's always been very close cooperation ever since the State of Israel was established in 1948 between the Israeli military, Israeli security and Israeli intelligence with the UK, and that continues. The events of October 2023, which were obviously awful for those people that were attacked and awful for the hostages that were taken, was used mercilessly by Israel as an excuse to commit genocide against children in Gaza and to reoccupy the West Bank. And indeed, Netanyahu has taken it several stages further down the line, which is essentially that Israel intends to annex the West Bank and Gaza, in contravention of what was actually very controversial and remains so, the Oslo Agreement, which actually gave part of the West Bank into total Palestinian sovereignty and other parts into Israel control of it. In reality, there is no area of the West Bank or Gaza that is controlled by Palestinians. It is all under military occupation. And if you talk to Palestinian people on the West Bank or in Gaza, their whole life has been under occupation. I mean, I've been 9 times in Palestine, and you talk to people, and their whole life is aggressive military presence on the streets, checkpoints, searches, abuse, and disappearances, and thousands of people held on under administrative detention in Israeli jails including children.
And I wanted to ask you just about your perception of the UK discourse around Israel and Palestine now, because you've, in Parliament, I would say, been the leading parliamentarian to support the Palestinian cause over the last 40 years. It does seem to me that there has been a shift in the past 2 years on Israel. Even if you look at polling, the favourability ratings for Israel, the lowest they've ever been on record. People have been exposed in a way, thanks to social media largely, to the reality of what the occupation you described is. Do you agree with that? And do you think that this is a moment we can, amidst all the horror, we can push forward to finally get justice for the Palestinians?
There's never been a greater understanding of the Palestinian cause than there is now. There's never been a greater level of sympathy for the Palestinian people than there is now. And as you know, I've been in Parliament since the 1980s. And then to raise Palestine in any form at all was extremely difficult. Those that wanted to raise criticism of Israel back in 1967 under the Six-Day War found a very, very hard time just trying to raise it at all in Parliament. It's very different now. And interestingly, a lot of MPs have come to it from a very different position. I mean, Sir Gerald Kaufman, the late Sir Gerald Kaufman, I mean, I knew him very well. He told me he was a Zionist. He was brought up raising money for the Israel Land Fund. He was brought up supporting Israel. And indeed, he used to call Golda Meir one of his great friends. And then, as time went on, Gerald became more and more critical of what was going on. And I've never forgotten, he came to me and he said that he'd been invited to be part of this delegation of parliamentarians from across Europe to go to Gaza. Would I come with him? I said, yeah, sure. So we went with a lot of other parliamentarians, and we met up in Cairo, then went by bus, so 2 or 3 buses of us, to Rafah and into Gaza. I've never forgotten stopping in a cafe in Port Said. It was basically a lorry driver's pull-up, this huge, dusty old cafe. And so we all go in there to try and get some coffee and stuff on the way, which was a bit surprising with the people in the cafe, particularly the truck drivers. And then, for reasons I don't really understand, Gerald decided to give us all a briefing and climbed on a table in the cafe and gave a speech. So these truck drivers coming in, wow, who's this guy? What's he doing? So Gerald's standing there explaining the purpose of the delegation. It was a lovely sight, actually. And then we went into Gaza, and Gerald and I, well, lots of others, met many people. Then on another occasion, we went to Beirut, and we visited Sabra and Shatila, talked to the refugees there. And he said in Parliament that his Jewish grandmother didn't suffer in the Warsaw Ghetto, that Palestinians would suffer in Gaza and the West Bank. It was a very, very powerful moment. And when I went to his funeral in Leeds, there was quite a lot of people there from the Muslim community in his constituency who just came to thank him for what he did. Politically, he and I would probably disagree on lots of things, but he made the journey, and I think he will always be remembered as somebody who spoke up for Palestine.
Okay.
That's an example, but then there's others. Kit Malthouse, for example, made some very good statements on this.
Finally, I'm just going to play devil's advocate here, because I know what the Labour Party will say, and probably the Tories as well. They'll say Jeremy Corbyn just wants to cause trouble and create a scandal where there's no scandal. We don't need an inquiry. Britain's not complicit. What do you say to people who say we don't need an inquiry, that Britain's not a participant or complicit in the Gaza genocide, this is an Israeli crime? What do you say to people like that?
Wake up, smell the coffee, read the evidence. Britain is supplying weapons, flying over Gaza, using RAF Akrotiri, building F-35 planes. 60,000 people have already been killed in Gaza that we know about. A lot have been killed in the West Bank. The key to peace in the whole region is justice for the Palestinian people. And you all know that.
And do you have a specific message for Keir Starmer and David Lammy, and John Healey, actually, at the Ministry of Defence?
You three hold very, very important positions. Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, Defence Secretary. You could go down in history as 3 European ministers who actually did something good for the Palestinian people. Instead, you choose to sell weapons. You choose to take part in this cover-up. You choose to allow the occupation to continue. Yes, you do express concern about the starvation of Palestinian children and people in Gaza. Expressing concern is only 10% of the journey. Make the other 90%. Stop the arms supplies and instead supply food and medicine and aid and make sure it gets there.
A lot of people, I mean, you've been involved in anti-war activism for many, many decades, and you've seen a lot of atrocities being committed by all sorts of different countries. But a lot of people say that the last 2 years has changed them because we've been seeing the brutality on our phones, and also that there are some unique aspects of the genocide in Gaza which are uniquely horrific, like the fact they're trapped, and the fact that 70% of them are refugees or descendants of refugees, and the fact that Israel is one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world, and it's just got this death camp of 2 million people that it can just testing all this stuff on. So just on a personal level, do you feel changed after watching what you have for the last 2 years and watching the complicity and participation of your own government?
These things have made all the difference. By having contact, by being able to follow things quickly, it's made a big difference. Yes, I've been involved in peace and humanitarian campaigns all my life, and my mum and dad were involved in campaigns in support of the Spanish Republic, and I was active first in the Vietnam War and many other campaigns. And sometimes you get a lot of abuse in public for whatever you do. I remember as a school kid being abused in school because I was standing up for Vietnam.
Okay.
And my classmates, when I'd walk in the morning after something horrendous had happened in Vietnam, they'd start chanting in my direction, "Better dead than red, better dead than red." They all came around in the end. They all realised what Vietnam was actually about, which was American bombardment of innocent people. What's different now is the public understanding and perception. The morning after the manoeuvre in opposition made by the Labour front bench to prevent there being a proper vote on calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, I was at a meeting at our town hall in Islington, and I decided to walk back to my office in Finsbury Park because it was a nice morning. I just felt like I needed some air, so I walked through Highbury Fields and back to my office. I'd never known it before. People came up to me and said, "Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for standing up for justice for the Palestinian people." And that is very, very unusual that people take much interest in foreign affairs or foreign policy. These were, if I may use the word, ordinary people who just said they're appalled and shocked about what's going on. It's different. 1 million people at least in Britain have consciously gone out and done something to support the Palestinian people. That's far more than ever did on Vietnam. The numbers involved in Vietnam, yes, there were big rallies, but there was nothing like this level of consciousness. Iraq, yes, we had our rally of more than 1 million in February 2003, but again, the numbers now involved in consciously supporting the Palestinian people and the large number of Jewish people that join in our demonstration, the Jewish Bloc, Jewish Voices for Labour and so on, are huge. And also, bravely, some people in Israel are saying, this has got to stop, the occupation has got to end. We want to live with Palestinian people. Fair play to them.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you. As a journalist, I also would like to thank you and others in Parliament who are trying to get transparency around this, because I feel like, having worked on this for nearly 2 years now, we're just scratching the surface, and once it starts to unravel, there'll be many, many elements we're not even aware about of British participation and complicity in this genocide, which The people that ordered it, the ministers that overseen the policy need to be held accountable. So hopefully it is the start of that process. Thanks a lot.
Palestine Deep Dive is a very important part of our whole landscape of media in this country, because it's investigating and it's building up this whole grouping of social media and mainstream media outlets that are serious journalists, serious about going for the truth, serious about holding public authorities and public figures, even people like me, to account on what they do. So, why don't you support Palestine Deep Dive? Join in, subscribe, give them the support they deserve, and thank them for the support they give all of us who are trying to bring about a more peaceful, more just world.